The lobotomy story is worse than you might think. This is why lobotomies are worse than you imagine. In the mid-20th century, lobotomy was considered one of the supposedly most effective and easiest interventions for treating mental disorders. Up to 40,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States alone, and 17,000 in the United Kingdom between 1940 and 1970. In Norway, about 3,000 lobotomies were carried out between 1940 and 1960. Today, lobotomy is considered one of the worst and most serious mistakes in the history of medicine. But why did anyone think destroying the brain of mental patients with an ice pick was a good idea? Why did the creator of the lobotomy win the Nobel Prize? Why did President Kennedy's father think it was a good idea to have his daughter undergo a lobotomy? In this video, we will explore the history of lobotomy, its effects, and how even the prestigious Kennedy family experienced its terrifying consequences. Let's get started. Let's start from the beginning. What is lobotomy? Lobotomy was a form of neurological treatment now obsolete that involved cutting several connections of the brain's frontal lobes. There were various techniques to perform a lobotomy, but one of the most well-known was the standard prefrontal lobotomy, which involved drilling holes into the skull through which a surgical instrument was inserted to cut, damage, or remove parts of the frontal lobe. Later, the transorbital lobotomy was developed, a less invasive procedure where instruments were inserted through the eye socket to reach the frontal lobe. The procedure was created as an alternative treatment for psychiatric disorders such as epilepsy, schizophrenia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and even depression. It was also implemented in cases of people with learning difficulties or those who exhibited aggressive behaviors. Moreover, this procedure was sometimes used to cure homosexuality. The goal of the procedure was to reduce the symptoms of these disorders, and it was known that this was achieved at the expense of the patient's intellect and personality. The immediate effects after a lobotomy were similar in all cases: loss of spontaneous responsibility, self-control, and even consciousness. Most patients were left emotionally and intellectually restricted. Sometimes they even lost motor abilities, and many evidently died. The inventor of this procedure was the Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz, who took inspiration from previous lobotomy work on chimpanzees, particularly the study by Swiss psychiatrist Gottlieb Burckhardt. The first human lobotomy was originally called leucotomy. It consisted of removing the connective fibers of active neurons. When Moniz first performed the procedure, he drilled 2 holes in the patient's skull and then injected ethanol into the white matter of the brain's frontal lobes. This acted as a sclerosing agent that caused irritation and irreversible damage to the blood vessels, leading to the formation of fibrous tissue and obliteration of the vessel, thus destroying the connections between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain. In 1848, an explosion propelled a bar slightly over 1 meter long and almost 6 kilograms in weight through the skull of Phineas Gage, a railroad construction foreman. Despite his miraculous survival, he was no longer the same. Although he was intellectually intact, he transformed from a friendly man into someone irritable and rude, with few inhibitions. It is reported that his personality returned to normal after a couple of years. Allegedly, he carried the iron bar that had pierced his brain with him until he died from a seizure 12 years later. Swiss psychiatrist Gottlieb Burckhardt is considered the first specialist in the field of modern psychosurgery, a discipline that combines surgical interventions as part of psychiatric treatments. Burckhardt began his work in his field in 1888, 40 years after Gage's accident, focusing on the treatment of schizophrenia. Despite apparently having no surgical training, Burckhardt decided to remove sections of the brain from his patients in a procedure called focal cortical brain excision. 6 individuals underwent his open brain surgery. One died 5 days later due to complications. Others experienced epilepsy and weakness, and were unable to understand writing or speech. The surgery was considered a success in 3 patients, describing as being calmed by the procedure. These results shocked and horrified the scientific community, leading to the rejection and dismissal of his ideas. However, they were not entirely forgotten. In 1935, chimpanzees Becky and Lucy were used as subjects in experiments in this same area. Neuroscientists John Fulton and Carly Jacobson published a study showing the results of tissue removal in their temporal lobes. According to their findings, chimpanzees who previously became enraged when they failed a task appeared calmer, happier, and more tranquil after the surgery. These results, presented at the International Neurological Congress, inspired Moniz to perform the first human lobotomy. Neurologist and psychiatrist Walter J. Freeman performed the first recorded lobotomy in the United States on September 14, 1936. The patient was Alice Hammett, who was 63 years old at the time and a patient at George Washington University Hospital. By 1942, 6 years after Hammett's operation, Freeman and Watts had performed 200 lobotomies. They reported that 63% of the patients showed improvement after the procedure, 23% experienced no changes, and 14% experienced severe deterioration or death. Aiming to simplify lobotomies so they could be performed in psychiatric hospitals where there were often no operating rooms, surgeons, or anesthesia, and budgets were limited, Freeman invented the transorbital lobotomy. This approach involved placing an orbital clasp under the eyelid and against the top of the eye socket, then using a mallet to drive the orbital clasp through the thin layer of bone and into the brain. The third sister of the Kennedy dynasty, Rosemary, born on September 13, 1918, in Massachusetts, underwent a transorbital lobotomy performed by Freeman in 1941 when she was 23 years old. The operation was disastrous, leaving Rosemary with severe mental disabilities and drastic personality changes. Rosemary Kennedy's lobotomy had significant consequences for her and her family. After the surgery, not only did Rosemary not improve, but she also became incapacitated. She could no longer speak or walk properly. It took months of physical therapy for her to regain mobility in one arm. The Kennedy family kept her story secret for many years, and Rosemary lived in an institution for people with mental disabilities until her death in 2005. 40% of Dr. Freeman's patients were homosexual. Originally, lobotomy was reserved for emergency cases considered desperate, severe, or irreparable. However, the case of the transorbital lobotomy led to a significant expansion of the procedures. It began to be implemented in mild cases, depressions, or anxieties. Perhaps the most chilling aspect was that 40% of Freeman's lobotomy patients were healthy homosexual individuals who were subjected to lobotomy with the aim of changing their sexual orientation. Dr. Freeman lobotomized 19 minors, including children and adolescents, like Howard Dully, one of the youngest survivors of lobotomy. Dully was only 12 years old in 1960 when Freeman performed a lobotomy on him at the request of his father and stepmother. After the procedure, Dully exhibited behavioral problems, attended special schools, was incarcerated in a specialized hospital, and eventually became an alcoholic and homeless. Freeman performed 3,439 lobotomies during his life. This means that several hundred people died as a result. The most notable case was that of Helen Mortensen, who died in February 1967 after her third lobotomy performed by Freeman. Mortensen developed a brain hemorrhage and died on the operating table. Due to this, Freeman lost his medical license and could no longer operate. Why did lobotomies become so popular, especially in the United States and Scandinavian countries? From the beginning, there were many criticisms of the procedure, as the idea of disconnecting a part of a person's brain and nullifying their personality was evidently barbaric and simply unacceptable. However, the social context in which they became popular is crucial. In the years following World War II, severe mental illnesses were abundant and there was a shortage of effective treatments. While other areas of medicine had experienced near miraculous advances, such as antibiotics, lobotomy was initially considered a similar breakthrough, especially in Anglo-American and Scandinavian media. The proliferation of this treatment seems to have been largely based on Freeman's charisma and his ability to excite the public in the media. The story of lobotomy, from being experimental to becoming a standard treatment, shares similarities with how other medical revolutions develop. Although now considered one of the greatest errors in modern medicine, lobotomy was promoted by charismatic opinion leaders with good media access like Freeman, who, despite later disapproval, maintained a strong belief in his treatment. Lobotomies were regarded as a miraculous cure for mental problems. One of the problems in psychiatry was the lack of objective measures to evaluate the effectiveness of treatments, and lobotomy seemed to yield good results based on existing measures. Although now seen as barbaric, at the time it was considered a humanitarian advance, as patients retained their IQ and many required fewer coercive measures after treatment. Many who witnessed the early operations were convinced that lobotomy reduced suffering and that some patients experienced an almost miraculous effect. And yes, believe it or not, the inventor of the lobotomy, Antonio Agas Moniz, won a Nobel Prize for his discovery. The furor over lobotomies was such that, in 1949, Moniz received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of the therapeutic value of lobotomy in certain psychoses. Curiously, however, in 1938, Moniz was attacked with 8 gunshots by one of his psychiatric patients, who accused him of not providing the appropriate treatment for his condition. Despite the criticism of lobotomy, the Nobel Prize awarded to its creators has not been officially revoked. Humans have a history of making holes in the head. Trepanation has been practiced since the Paleolithic era. Trepanation is the drilling or scraping of a hole in the skull, and although lobotomy is the most recent example we have found of this activity, Charles G. Gross, author of A Hole in the Head, states that thousands of trepan skulls have been discovered worldwide. Specimens of both sexes and all ages date from the end of the Paleolithic era to the present. It is not clear why the first trepanations were performed, but scientists have identified hard stone knives, obsidian or flint knives, metal knives, and drills as trepidation tools. One of the earliest texts from the Hippocratic corpus, which describes various types of head wounds, suggests that trepanation was a recommended treatment even in cases of mild contusions. A probable reason, according to Gross, is that Hippocratic physicians saw stagnant blood, like stagnant water, as harmful. Therefore, letting the blood flow would prevent it from decomposing. Trepanation was also used to treat cases of epilepsy and mental illnesses. A 10th century text recommended opening the skulls of people with epilepsy to let out the humors and air to evaporate. In 1955, the antipsychotic drug Thorazine was approved in the United States, marking the beginning of a new era of treatments for severe mental illnesses through the use of medication instead of surgery. At the same time, portrayals of lobotomized characters in literature, film, and theater further illuminated the failures of the mental health care system. In the play Suddenly Last Summer, 1958, by Tennessee Williams, later adapted into a film with Elizabeth Taylor and Katharine Hepburn, a woman is forcibly lobotomized when her wealthy aunt fears she will reveal family secrets. In 1975, Jack Nicholson played a patient in a power struggle with the terrifying Nurse Ratched in the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, based on the 1962 novel of the same name, in which his character undergoes a lobotomy. The Soviet Union officially banned lobotomies in 1950, but in some Scandinavian countries and others like France, they continued until the 1980s. Despite general disapproval, there have been some recent recorded cases of lobotomy. Scottish singer Lena Zavaroni, diagnosed with depression and anorexia, opted to undergo a lobotomy in September 1999, but died of pneumonia a month later. However, in cases where no other treatment options have succeeded and the patient can give informed consent, brain surgery for mental disorders continues under the name of psychosurgery. These operations are rare. Only 4 were performed in the UK between 2015 and 2016. The legacy of lobotomy is filled with horror and loss, but it isn't all negative. A procedure called a cingulotomy is similar and can reduce the symptoms of OCD, but it targets the anterior capsule near the thalamus. A subcaudal tractotomy of the caudate nucleus can treat depression, anxiety, and OCD. Leucotomies are still performed, considered a combination of subcaudal tractotomy and major cingulotomy. All these procedures are in some way heirs to lobotomy, but in ethical, non-aggressive forms, with clear objectives and without the severe effects of the past. In fact, Burkhart's original procedure is still used today. Focal cortical resection is now used to remove damaged brain tissue that can cause seizures in children. We hope this video has been useful to you. If you have anything to add, please share it with us in the comments section. Give this video a thumbs up and share the link with your family and best friends so they can learn more about why lobotomy is worse than you imagine. If you're new to our channel, don't forget to subscribe. Be sure to follow us on all social media platforms, which will be linked below in the description. Remember, a nation that does not know its history is doomed to repeat it. I'll see you in the next video.